Hey guys, Yips here, coming at you with another video, and today I want to take some time to talk about the new raid, Nyalotha. I took some video recordings this week, however I wasn't really happy with them. I didn't feel like I was playing that well from a mechanical standpoint. My rotations when I was watching it back seemed a little bit off, so I'm going to try to record more footage next week, hopefully be a little bit happier and be able to make some boss guides for you guys. I will include a link in the description below to a straw poll with all of the bosses listed. Vote on which boss you want to see me make a video on. I will pick the top 2 to make guides on for next week. So whether you be Nyalotha or Vexiona or a combination of whatever 2 of these bosses, I will release video guides with commentary over them, talking about what I think you should be doing on the fight in order to maximize your potential in the raid. So in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over bosses that I feel are good to talk about from a DPS standpoint, talk about how I think you could be doing really effective damage against them, talk about the difference between effective damage and maximizing your damage on the boss fight, and see which one is better for you. I've also will include this Excel sheet that tells you which major essences, minor essences, I think are good for each of the boss fights, as well as what sort of setup you should be running in terms of Azerite if you have it. So the raid overall was okay. I wasn't super thrilled about any of the heroic bosses, but heroic is hard to judge compared to mythic. However, there are some things on some of the bosses that you definitely should be doing on heroic, whether you're progressing or just going through and farming for mythic here. Whatever it might be, there are a few notes that I do want to talk about. So the bosses that I think are fairly straightforward are bosses like Wrathion, Prophet Skitra, Dark Inquisitor, Shadhar. I think all of those bosses are fairly straightforward in terms of what you need to be doing as a DPS. There are a few little things here and there that you can do to increase your overall damage. For example, on Wrathion, you can pop your second set of cooldowns during the phase where you get the pillars to come up, and that can be a huge increase to your overall DPS. On boss fights like Prophet Skitra, you can run a flashpoint setup and you can get flashpoint and a bunch of different shards or inevitable demise stacks off of the adds in the down phase, so you can off dot them while hitting the main target for a large single target increase. And for the other bosses like Shadhar, it's just a patchwork burn. It's pretty straightforward, but for some of the other bosses, I do think it's worth touching on some of the mechanics on what you could be doing to do a little bit more damage on them. I think Mott is also one that's fairly straightforward. It's just a single target fight with some ad cleave at the beginning that isn't too important. So let's jump into the first one. That's going to be the Hive Mind boss. Now, Hive Mind is a fight where you could do a lot more damage, but it would be completely irrelevant depending on your guild. If you're carrying your guild in terms of DPS, that DPS might not be irrelevant, but a lot of the time, the damage that you want to be doing is actually going to be boss DPS, not so much ad DPS. So if we take a look at damage done to the 2 bosses, you can see here I was doing 23k DPS to Khazir, and on Tekris I was doing 43k DPS, which is quite a lot of single target output on the 2 bosses. And you can look at my damage breakdown. I didn't actually do very much damage to the Ravagers. If we compare that damage to the other players in the raid, you can actually see I was quite close to the bottom in terms of Ravager DPS, and that's all of the little small adds that spawn. So there are ways that you can maximize your damage on this fight, and that would be to do more damage to the Ravagers, do more damage to the adds, and there's also the way you can play a single target. And I think if you're in a guild that is comfortable dealing with the Ravagers, it's often better just to focus your damage on pure single target. And the way that you do that is you pretty much ignore the adds. You're not casting things like Rain of Fire. You're strictly using your Chaos Bolts on the bosses with your Havocs. You off dot the adds, at least some of them, with Immolate, but you're never going to spam Immolate on all of the little adds unless you have a Cataclysm available, and that will really show in the log. If you look at Destro locks in general on Hive Mind, and you go to Warlocks and you go to Destruction, you'll see a lot of the top parsers. If I was to all of a sudden look at this and just say, okay, there's quite a few people here above 100,000, that could be due to Vision RNG, but for the most part, there's a few people here above 100,000, a few people in the 90s. Is all of a sudden you go to damage to bosses, you're going to see these names change like crazy. So it's a whole list of a bunch of different people. Yes, some people are still there and are still doing a lot of boss damage, but for the most part, a lot of the names change, and that's because they're damage shifted more to the boss instead of focusing on dealing maximum amount of damage on the fight overall. And I think that if you're in a guild that's progressing the fight, I think damage overall is really good, but if you're in a higher end guild, it's often more useful just to deal boss DPS. If you're playing Affliction on this fight, don't even begin to think about running a AoE dot build. Just you're going to be focusing on the bosses and doing as much 2-target DPS as possible. Otherwise, you should be playing something like Demonology instead. So that's my general specific for Hivemind. Just try to do as much 2-target DPS as you can while keeping immolates on the major adds and focusing down the volatile ravagers, and it will be overall better for your guild even though you may be doing less DPS overall. So let's just go back here to the next boss that I want to mention something on. We can just go to ourselves here. Let me just do this. Alright, so that's Hivemind. Hivemind's a pretty patty fight. The next one that I want to talk a little bit about is Drestagath, I guess. So on Drestagath, this fight is where you have a main boss that you can attack all the time, and the damage that you do to him does count towards the log, so you could sit there single targeting the whole time, and all of that damage will count towards your parse. However, you don't want to be doing that. So you'll see on a lot of logs that are at the top on this fight, not necessarily for Warlock, but for a lot of other classes, it's just them single target patting on the boss the whole time while switching to adds that are buffed. A lot of the time on Warlock, you're actually... well, you really shouldn't be doing that as any class. You should be going out and killing the tentacles, getting the buff, and then attacking the boss. However, specifically on Warlock, you often want to just be using your cooldowns to burst down adds when they get the damage buff. So on this fight, your tank gets a circle on him that he can drag over to the adds. During that circle, when it expires, it makes the adds take 40% more damage, and you want to be focusing on the Maws and I believe the Corruptor tentacles, and you want to leave the smoke ones to the melee. And using your cooldowns on that is really effective because it clears the tentacles really fast and allows your group to get the buffs quickly in order to deal damage to the boss. It also allows you to get efficient 2-target cleave out as a Destrolock. So you can see my damage breakdown here. The majority of it was on the Maw and the Eyes of Drestagath. However, I still did a good amount of boss damage, which is good because every time that I finished killing those adds, I would pick up a puddle and use the remainder of my cooldowns on the boss with really high stacks. So just make sure on this boss that you're not padding on the actual boss himself and you're watching for the tank to move out with those buffs, using cooldowns on those buffs, and then the remainder of your cooldowns will go into the boss the last 10 seconds or so once you've finished cleaning up those adds. So Drestagath, it's a pretty straightforward fight. It's pretty easy to DPS on. There's not too much to talk about there. If you're playing Affliction, ID will probably be reasonably good on this boss fight. However, you have to think that when you get the buff, all of the adds are going to be gone. So maybe triple racking, triple cascading might be a little bit better on that fight. It just kind of depends how it works. If your guild is killing all the adds at the same time, you're not going to be wanting to run that setup. However, if your guild is killing the adds in a spread fashion, Inevitable Demise will pick up some single target value there. Another boss that I wanted to talk about, the two specifically, were Vexiona and Raden. I think those two bosses are fairly interesting. First, we can talk about Raden. So Raden is a boss that spawns orbs and adds. So you would kill a lightning orb and then a shadow add would spawn, and then you would kill the shadow orb and a lightning add would spawn. Something that you want to be doing as a Destrolock on this boss fight is gauging how much DPS your guild actually has. So my guild, we have a lot of really high level DPSers, so orbs die really quickly. They have a much smaller proportion of HP compared to the adds that spawn. What that means is I'm not actually going to be using my Havocs on the orbs. I'm going to be using my Havocs on the Void Hunter and the Crackling Stalker. So if we take a look at my cast breakdown, you can see my first Havoc was on the orb, but after that, I start Havocing the Stalker and the Void Hunter. The reason being is because these two first adds are good for me to kill as Destro because I have a lot of damage because I'm using my cooldowns, but afterwards I'm pretty well out of cooldowns and my guild is forced to hard switch to them. So the idea is the Destrolock solo the first couple, but then after that we need help. And if everyone in the guild switches to those, they're going to die too quickly. You're not going to get your Havoc value. This means that you should be Havocing later on the Crackling Stalker because the time differential between them isn't enough to where you would be able to get 2 Havocs in. You're only going to get 1. Now, if your guild is doing low DPS to the orbs, then you probably want to be Havocing every single orb to make sure that it dies. This also means that you'll probably get 2 Havoc windows because the add will also die slowly, which would be an increase of DPS overall, but you have to gauge it for yourself. Make sure you're using your Havoc to its fullest potential in this boss fight. Don't just be spamming it randomly. Also, if we take a look at the replay really quickly and we take a look at the boss room, your group is generally stacked up in the middle and adds spawn from here and from here, make sure that when these orbs are spawning that you're pre-positioned in a way that you can instantly start dotting it in order to get your flashpoint buff. If you're stacked here and the ad spawns over here, you won't be in range to cast your Immolate right away, or your Agony, or whatever sort of button you're using. So make sure you're always pre-positioning whichever way the ad is going to spawn in order to get that flashpoint uptime. Otherwise, other people might start DPSing it, and by the time you put your Immolate on it, you're not actually going to get that buff, which is a pretty big deal. So make sure that you're thinking about your positioning as well as your Havoc usage. Make sure you're maximizing that in this fight. Really, really important stuff. Okay, the next boss I wanted to talk a little bit about is Vexiona. So Vexiona is a boss that spawns a ton of little ads that are fairly irrelevant. They do it sort of depends on your guild level, but for the most part they're fairly irrelevant. This means you want to be using a lot of your damage just for single target. So the way you want to play in this boss fight is probably not to maximize your damage overall, but just to use the ads for additional shards in order to pump more DPS into the boss. As a Destro Lock, if you have cooldowns running and you have a ton of Immolates out, when you use things like Lucid or you have Infernals out, you're going to be getting so many extra shards from all of those ads, from the Immolates and things like that, that you're going to be able to use a lot more Chaos Bolts during your cooldowns, which means you'll get your Supremacy stacks faster, which means more overall single target. And if you're playing AF on this boss, run full single target. Like, don't even think about dealing with the ads. Again, this does kind of depend on the guild that you're in. If your guild's damage is low, obviously you'll need more ad damage, but if you're running with a guild where people are capable of handling the ads, you're going to be wanting to focus more on single target. So, that being said, on this boss fight, you do have some options. You can choose to run a Flashpoint Rolling Havoc build and do a lot of damage in Phase 1 and Phase 2. However, when the boss hits, I believe it's 40% or something like this, he stops spawning ads. This means no more Flashpoint value and no more Rolling Havoc value. They are dead traits for the rest of the boss fight. So on Mythic difficulty, depending how difficult that burn is, you will not run a Rolling Havoc Flashpoint setup. You will run a more single target oriented setup and potentially even playing Affliction, because I can't imagine on Mythic difficulty that your guild is going to have problems killing the ads, but I can imagine a world where that 40-0 burn is rather difficult, in which case you will want more single target. If you look at the damage at the end of the fight when the ads stop spawning, and you look at the overalls, you can see quite far down at the bottom. Yes, my cooldowns were up here and I didn't get a second set of Infernals. That would put me a lot higher if I did get my second set, probably in the 55,000 DPS range. I was only able to use it once and then the boss died. So on Mythic difficulty, yes, I'd probably get 2 sets of cooldowns instead of 1, which would boost my single target, but those Flashpoint Rolling Havoc traits definitely are not helping me in this last phase of the boss fight. And Affliction, honestly, would probably be fairly solid on this boss. You would push to the 40% burn faster, especially if you're running ID traits and funneling into the boss. And not only that, you would also have really, really good single target for the 40-0 burn, especially if you run things like Drain Soul Execute, which I actually think is excellent for this raid on a lot of boss fights, or different sort of sources like that. So Vexiona, play your damage smart. Don't think about doing overall too much. However, Destro does have the potential to do a lot of DPS if the opportunity does so present itself. The next boss that I want to mention a little bit about is going to be Nyalotha the Corruptor. I don't think Carapace is worth talking about. A lot of people just pat on this boss fight. I would highly recommend just focusing on what matters, which is either single target or killing the malignant growths. However, you can do a lot of ad damage as a Destro Warlock if the situation arises. But in the last phase, I will say this. If you Cataclysm all of the small ads with your Infernals and you start pressing Chaos Bolt, you will not run out of shards. You will gain so many from all of those Immolates that you have active that you're able to do so much single target boss damage. And don't forget to Havoc a little ad, especially if you're running Rolling Havoc stacks. Don't wait till all the ads are dead. Havoc early and get that intellect buff when you're tunneling onto the boss. Just some little minor things to think about. And finally, on Nyalotha the Corruptor. This boss has a few different ways to play against it, so I'm going to talk about both of them. So on this boss, there are 3 phases. There's the up phase. There's with all the tentacles, the bashers, the corruptors, things like that. There's the down phase with the psychus, and then there's the last phase with the boss and the thought harvesters. Now, when I play in my guild, I don't go down to kill psychus. I stay up and I kill the bashers and the corruptor tentacles. The reason being is because mages and paladins are able to go down for me. So Typically, when you go down, you get a debuff, which doesn't let you go down to attack Psychus again. However, mages and paladins can immune this off and then go back down again. And I am more valuable upstairs than they are, so it's better for me to be up and for them to be down. However, that being said, Destro Warlock is probably one of the best specs at dealing Psychus damage in the game, possibly even better than mages because it's able to havoc the tentacle ads, kill those. You can make the argument that mages is igniting them as well, so it's probably fairly even, but Destro can do a lot of damage to Psychus, is the point that I'm trying to make. However, on this log, you can see obviously I only got my phase 1 Psychus damage, which happened here. And for the rest of the fight, I am just attacking tentacles. I'm using my 2 minutes on cooldown, so I use them here at about 1 minute into the fight, and then 3 minutes, and then 5 minutes, and then 8 minutes with Lust. Generally speaking, that's going to be your cooldown timing regardless. However, you do want to save your cooldowns if you are going down for Psychus. And typically, you want to be using your cooldowns when the boss has 2 to 3 stacks of the damage buff. So playing on this fight, it just sort of depends what your guild gets you to do. One thing that is worth noting is you're able to attack the boss when the tentacles aren't active, and this will actually stack infinite stars. So if you have that trait, make sure you're doing that. But it also allows you to get 5 soul shards every time before the tentacles spawn. And when that happens, what you can see often happens is when I'm using my cataclysms, I'm actually casting Rain of Fires around them. And this isn't actually a DPS increase in terms of if I was able to just sit there and attack a mob. I would actually prefer, after I use my Cataclysm on all the tentacles, to go into a Havoc burn. But there are a lot of tentacles that don't spawn around the Basher. And what that means is I'm at 5 shards. I just Cataclysmed and I can immolate 2 or 3 more targets. I choose to Rain of Fire my shards off so I'm not shard capped, and then I go into my Havoc window with a bunch of extra immolates out, which are pumping into my shard gen, which allows me to, every time that I Havoc, cast a ton of Chaos Bolts. Let's see if we can make this a little prettier. You can see that my Havoc windows are actually quite large in terms of how many Chaos Bolts I cast after them, and that's because I have so many immolates rolling, and I'm just casting Rain of Fire in order to dump my initial shards while I'm generating more. And don't forget to also use your Conflag charges at the start there. Hopefully I'll have a video on this boss fairly soon for you guys so you can see more clearly what I'm talking about. If you're playing as Alpha on this boss, Inevitable Demise is very good, Drain Soul is very good. A lot of this fight you do increase damage in Execute, or the boss is simply in Execute, and you can also shard snipe a lot with it. It's quite powerful. So just a few little notes there. I know I kind of talked for a while there, and it might be a lot to take in. Again, in below, there will be a straw poll link to bosses. Choose which one you want me to make a video on. Hopefully this was slightly helpful for you, those who are progressing on the fight. If you guys want me to do log review guides on specific bosses, let me know in the comments. Bosses that I think are decent to talk about would be Rawden, perhaps Vexiona, maybe N'Zoth as well. I can go over stuff like that in logs, but I think some of the other bosses are fairly, well, they're not the most interesting, and you can do a lot of damage that doesn't matter in this raid, and I think that's something that's really important, is you can do a lot of damage that doesn't matter, and it's going to be important to pick out the damage that does matter, and hopefully I can help you guys with that as we move forward. So thanks for watching. Hope you guys have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.